The remainder of this chapter will be looking at basically how the budget can be used to achieve each of the 5 economic goals we looked at in Unit 3, as well as some other things like how the budget can be used to improve non-material living standards and how it can be used to get the budget back into surplus. So basically in each video I'll take you through each one of these 5 economic goals, and then we'll look at living standards more generally. So budgetary policy and low inflation. First of all, it's worth noting that budgetary policy is not the main instrument used to solve low inflation, or to achieve low inflation, sorry. High inflation is mainly solved by the RBA. The RBA will be the ones that will do the majority of the work that if we're in a peak to slow the economy down and reduce inflation. But budgetary policy can be used to assist the RBA to control inflation via a number of different avenues. Basically, if we want to achieve inflation, reduce inflation in the short term, the best way to reduce inflation in the short term is to implement contractionary measures. So anything that's going to increase the size of the structural surplus or reduce the structural deficit is designed to reduce spending, reduce aggregate demand, and reduce demand pull inflationary pressures. So in this year's budget, because it's a $2 billion smaller deficit than last year, you could argue that the mildly contractionary nature of the budget helps to achieve the goal of low inflation. Having said that, we know that there are expansionary policies within this budget that aren't really designed to reduce inflation, and inflation is not that big an issue at the moment. So if inflation is mainly demand-driven, driven by excess demand for products, the best way to control inflation, higher taxes, lower government spending, reduce tax concessions for businesses to invest. So if we give businesses tax concessions to invest, yes, that can help solve cost-push inflation in the long term, but any tax concessions we give to businesses that encourage investment will lead to increased aggregate demand in the short term because it makes things cheaper for them to invest. So examples of recent things that have helped to reduce inflation: scrapping the baby bonus, mothers have got less money, rising superannuation payments. So basically making people pay a higher percentage of their income in superannuation means they have less available for general spending and can help to reduce inflation. So making people pay more superannuation is a way to reduce inflationary pressures in the short term. If inflation is mainly supply driven, so rather than it being by excess demand, if inflation is occurring because of cost push inflation, so because of increased labour costs or higher oil prices or something that's causing us to increase prices because of higher cost of production, the government will be encouraged to implement supply side initiatives. So that's when they're going to initiate things like skilled immigration to make sure there's more people and more competition for jobs in the labour force, improve education, improve training in order to try and improve efficiency. So basically, if inflation is supply driven, the best way to solve that in the short term is to implement things like training programs, skilled migration, increase participation rates, perhaps reduce excise taxes, or that would be less likely, but it's basically involving improving the skills of our workforce. There are, however, some things that will reduce inflation in the long term but can cause even some short-term inflationary problems. So, for example, business investment spending, so if the government spends money on infrastructure, just be mindful of the distinction there. For example, if the government builds like the East-West link, that's a form of G2 investment spending, where if firms are investing themselves and growing their businesses, that's investment spending. Those initiatives are going to increase aggregate demand in the short term. Investment spending, G2, they're both forms of aggregate demand. So anything like that boosts demand in the short term, whether that be increased infrastructure, tax concessions for businesses to develop or invest, accelerated depreciation allowances. That's something they did last year where they basically allowed businesses to claim back tax quicker because they were able to depreciate their assets quicker. So what that basically meant is if you brought something worth, say, $20,000, let's say some form of machinery, then you were able to claim that back on tax and get about $6,000 back. So that encouraged you to buy new machinery, buy new equipment, which will help to reduce supply-side pressures in the long term and help reduce inflation and improve external stability because we'll become more productive in the long term. But in the short term, anything that's going to boost aggregate demand, like accelerated depreciation allowances, like infrastructure spending, will mean people will go out, will spend, will invest, and that will boost aggregate demand. So to sum up, infrastructure spending won't help inflation in the short term. Only once it's built, only once it's boosting our productive capacity. Accelerated depreciation allowances won't help in the short term. that will encourage firms to invest and therefore boost aggregate demand, and will also create jobs because people will go out and buy more things from Bunnings Warehouse, Harvey Norman, all those shops where you might buy things for your business. Maybe not so much Harvey Norman. Tax concessions that encourage investment, again, won't help in the short term, it'll only be in the long term. But if we're using subsidies to promote education or reduce costs of production, that will help in the short term because it will immediately reduce firms' costs of production. Likewise, if we're implementing contractionary policies that will slow down spending, like larger surpluses or reduced deficits, that should help to reduce inflation in the short term as well, because people won't spend as much. What we're going to talk about in class is the actual policies within this year's budget that have been designed to reduce inflation.